Hello and welcome to our webinar. My name is Dr. Robert Carter. I'm a speaker for Creation Ministries International, and tonight's topic is why Darwin got it wrong. But before I get into the meat of it, let me introduce you to CMI. We are the producers of Creation Magazine. We've been doing this for over 40 years. We host a gigantic website called creation.com, and I hope when I'm finished, maybe you'll go to creation.com and read some of our articles, specifically some of the articles that I'm going to be referring to in my talk. We also have a free email service we call Info Bites. What happens is basically every Friday, we'll package together something interesting, something new, some new scientific discovery that we just found out about, and we'll send it out to all the people on our list. I would highly encourage you to sign up for this. It's really easy to do. Let me give you two different ways. One, you can go to creation.com/infobites, or you can text your email and your zip code to this phone number, 470-344-INFO. So maybe your email address is creationfan@iheartcmi.com and your zip code is 77777. Easy peasy, put that into a text, send it to us, and we'll get you signed up. Now, this is not spam. We're not going to fill you up with daily or multiple daily things like some websites do, and we're not going to give your information to anybody else. It's just for our own internal use to connect you to some of the amazing information that we produce every week. Now, I'm going to be talking about Charles Darwin. The purpose of my talk is not to savage that man's reputation. I'm not going to call him stupid or anything like that. The purpose of this talk, though, is to fulfill something that we see in the Bible in 1 Peter 3:15. Let me read this verse to you. In your hearts, honor Christ the Lord as holy, always being prepared to make a defense to anyone who asks you for a reason for the hope that's in you, yet would do it with gentleness and respect. So as I address Charles Darwin's life and legacy, I want to make sure that I'm being respectful and I'm being gentle to people who might disagree. My purpose is not to throw barbs. My purpose is to inform and educate so that we as Christians, and if you're not a Christian, I would encourage you to maybe think a little bit about what I'm saying so that we can have a better grasp of these issues and understand where we are in the world right now. And I'm going to say, over the course of the next 40 minutes, a few things that Darwin did not know. Specifically, he knew nothing about modern geology, but his ideas on biology were based squarely on his ideas then of geology. He knew nothing about modern biology, certainly nothing about the field of genetics, and sadly, he apparently did not ever seem to understand basic Christian theology. We'll save that one for the end, though. Now, he's a man growing up in Victorian England. He was a rich man. His father was a doctor for society people, so lots of money in that family. He was trained in medicine, but he failed out of medical school. He couldn't stand a sight of blood. And being that he was the younger brother, his dad was like, what am I going to do with you now? So we sent him to Cambridge to study to become an Anglican priest. That's a very strange place for the father of evolutionary biology later. But when he's done at school, he's calling himself a geologist. Now already I'm getting confused at the complexity of this man's life, because here's the future of modern evolutionary biology is calling himself a geologist. Why? Well, because he wasn't thinking of biology yet. He, as a classic Victorian gentleman, is getting a well-rounded education in a lot of different fields. So he's expected to be able to understand multiple different fields of knowledge. And back then, this is the last time period where a person could pretty much understand most of what other people knew. Today, man, I have a PhD. You know what that means? I know this much about this much. I studied one particular protein family in Caribbean corals, and that's what I got my PhD on, because there's so much knowledge today that we have to subdivide and partition and drill down into very specific areas, but that was not true in Darwin's time. So the father of modern evolutionary biology is actually a geologist early on. Now, he had a lot of people influencing him, very important people. One of the most important people influencing Charles Darwin was his grandfather, Erasmus. Now, his grandfather died before Darwin was born, but Darwin grew up in a household full of evolution. Have you ever thought or heard that Charles Darwin invented evolutionary theory? It's not true. In fact, on the bottom left of this image in small, because I couldn't find a high res image of this, but this is the book plate that was on all the books in the library in the house that Charles Darwin grew up in. In fact, it was on the carriage, the family carriage. It's a coat of arms with 3 shells on a diagonal and then a Latin phrase, e conscius omnia, all from Shells. Yes, Darwin's grandfather believed in evolution, wrote a book about evolution that Darwin later on said he committed entire passages to memory. Darwin didn't invent the theory, he grew up with it. There's another very important and influential man in Charles Darwin's life named Adam Sedgwick. Now, Sedgwick was a Christian. He was a geologist, a very important geologist. Sedgwick named the Cambrian era. What's the Cambrian? That's in the evolutionary scheme, the earliest part of the fossil record has multicellular life. Well, Cambria is the ancient name for Wales, and Darwin had toured with Sedgwick in Wales the year before he finished up at Cambridge. So here's this guy studying rocks with some of the most influential geologists of the day. But then another person, Charles Lyell. Now, Lyell is a lawyer, and he's writing about geology. And he writes in some very important early books called The Principles of Geology. When Charles Darwin got on the HMS Beagle for his very famous 5-year voyage around the world, the captain, Captain Fitzroy, the Christian, the future anti-Darwinist, handed Darwin Lyell's first volume of The Principles of Geology. So here's Darwin going around the world, reading this book, and he's reading the phrase, the present is the key to the past. He's reading things that are only appealing to slow and gradual processes. Millions of years comes first. Decades later, Charles Darwin will invent evolutionary theory. But it's all predicated on old Earth ideas. In fact, Charles Darwin went here. This is a volcanic cone in the Galapagos Islands. We went here also when we were filming Darwin, the Voyage That Shook the World, an excellent movie, CMI's first movie we ever produced. We went around the world following Charles Darwin's footsteps. So we went here. In fact, we got in a boat and our boat sailed around here. We went through the center of it. This is really cool. But Darwin saw this and he said, oh, this must have taken millions of years to form this. Because look how eroded the edge of this volcano is and how the seas actually can get inside the volcanic cone. But Darwin was there during what we call a La Nina cycle. It's the opposite of the El Nino cycle. Now, during El Nino years, there's lots and lots of rain in the Galapagos. During La Nina, there's almost no rain. He was there and he saw these desert islands that 5 or 10 years later are going to turn green during the rainy season. But he was there and he saw very little rain. Therefore, he said, oh, slow and gradual, millions of years. It would have taken millions of years to erode this hill down to the way it looks today. But notice that the southern edge is more eroded than the northern edge. Why? Because all the storms, all the prevailing winds, they come up from the south. Almost all the islands in the Galapagos are actually sloped north to south because the southern part gets most of the erosion. And what Darwin didn't know is that one major storm can cause 10,000 years worth of erosion, of dry year erosion. So his slow and gradual idea was based on very limited sampling. And we can see lots of erosion happening quickly. And if erosion can happen quickly, it didn't take millions of years to carve this volcano down to the way it looked. You want to get Darwin, the Voyage That Shook the World? DVD, Blu-ray, digital download, creation.com. Just type in Voyage, you'll find it right away. But here's the father of modern biology, studying geology. And he did not know geology because back then we did not understand a lot of things. His idea was that continents slowly rose and slowly sank over millions of years, which is why there's seashells on top of continents. But geologists today, we talk about plate tectonics, that horizontal movement of plates. And as plates smash into each other and push up, it makes things like mountain ranges. Now, does CMI believe in tectonics? Yeah, we have a preferred model. We call it catastrophic plate tectonics. Go to creation.com, just type in plate tectonics. You'll find a lot of articles about this. There is good empirical scientific evidence that the plates have moved and have moved quickly, much more quickly than the slow and gradual idea tells us. And this is just a really neat aspect of creation geology, that geology can happen quickly. But if geology happens quickly, there's no millions of years, and there's no millions of years, there's no time for evolution. Darwin also rejected ideas about ice ages. In fact, they were discovered while he was alive, and he fought tooth and nail, arguing against any idea of ice ages. Why? Because an ice age is not the present is the key to the past. You can't look at the world today and say, see an ice age, therefore this is catastrophism. This is things happen more quickly than they're happening now. And so he resisted. Here's scientific resistance to scientific knowledge from the father of evolutionary biology, which we're about to get to. He also didn't understand sedimentation. Now, he would have been familiar with the White Cliffs of Dover. These cliffs are made of chalk, but the chalk, if you look at it under a microscope, these are coccolithophore shells. Now, coccolithophores are little teeny things that live in the ocean, and their shells, they estimate it would take about 100 years for a coccolithophore shell to settle to the bottom of the ocean. Therefore, since they're so small and they settle so slowly, obviously, to Darwin's mind, it would have taken millions of years to form the cliffs of Dover. But what about science? Science has changed. See, today, the old idea of slow and gradual sedimentation is not right, because we understand, in fact, there was a paper written a few years ago called On the Accumulation of Mud. That's funny. The scientists are still studying mud because we don't understand it. And what the scientists concluded was that mudstones, that is shale, limestone, mudstones, these are like massive parts of the geologic record. Mudstones can be deposited under more energetic conditions than widely assumed, requiring a reappraisal of many geologic records. Wait a second. How does this work? What happens is in turbulent water, little particles will bump into each other, and when they stick together, they make a bigger particle. And as particles flocculate, they just fall. And so under turbulent conditions, we can get a massive stripping of all the fine particles in the water column. Therefore, it might not have taken millions of years for the cliffs of Dover to form. All we need is turbulent water, which is happening during Noah's flood. But Darwin rejected the flood outright. Therefore, his millions of years idea applied to this, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I'm just trying to set up the idea that this man in the 1800s was working in a vacuum of knowledge. He simply didn't know what we know today. And if we reassess what he was talking about, well, we realize he got a lot of things wrong. Specifically this. In The Origin of Species, he wrote, and I quote, "No organism wholly soft can be preserved." But we find soft animals preserved all over the fossil record. There's jellyfish, worms. We find dinosaur bones where the inside isn't actually petrified and there's still squishy, stinky stuff in there. But wait a second. Why, if knowing that things can be soft and be preserved in the fossil record, why would Darwin wrote no organisms wholly soft can be preserved? Because slow and gradual, millions of years. If that's true, you would never expect something that's squishy to be buried and petrified because it would rot before it gets buried. But he was wrong. We see lots of soft and squishy things buried because the fossil record accumulated very quickly, not very slowly. Okay, let's get into biology now. Darwin, he's a geologist. He gets done with the voyage around the world. He goes back home. He inherits the estate. He starts doing all the science, and he writes his big fat book on barnacles. Now, if you're a nerd, you love this book. But most people, they look at this and they just yawn. Who could write that much about barnacles? But what this was, in modern days, this would have been his PhD dissertation. This man studied animals that no one had ever studied thoroughly, and he wrote this huge fat book on everything you could ever want to know about barnacles. And now he's got the credentials of a biologist, and he's studying biology. But wait a minute, I'm a biologist. What is a biologist? It's someone who studies living things. But I'm not a Darwinist. I don't believe in evolution. How can I be a biologist and not an evolutionist? It's easy, because in order to get there, you need to add philosophy. Watch this. Here is biology, the study of life. If you apply to that the cloak of naturalism, the belief that nature is all there is, the belief that natural processes can explain everything, you apply that to the study of life and you will get evolution. But if you apply theism, the belief in God, if you apply that to biology, you will get creation. Now, what form of creation? It depends upon your view of God. Now, I happen to be a Bible believer. I happen to take Genesis as history. Therefore, you would call me a young earth creationist or biblical creationist if you want to. That is CMI's basic position. All the people who work here agree with this. But in the end, you cannot have the study of life without applying some sort of philosophy. But when you do that, you're going to get one of these two forms of biology, evolutionist or creationist. Huh. You didn't know that science and philosophy are wrapped up around each other, did you? But even if theism or belief in God is philosophical, so is naturalism. You can't prove that nature is all there is. You can't prove that natural processes produce everything. It's an assumption. It was Darwin's assumption, and he also needed deep time to get there. But back in the day, in Darwin's time, they did not know what we know today about what's inside the cell. To him, the cell was just a bag of salts. And so if the salty bag could make a square or a circle or grow a spike or turn purple, I mean, it's easy to imagine anything happening if you don't understand the mechanisms inside it. To us today, though, the inside of the cell is a mind-bogglingly complex, highly engineered machine. And if you just look at the chemistry inside the cell, it should make your mouth hang open. Because biochemistry is crazy complicated, incredibly, exquisitely perfect, and unevolvable. You see, the more complex life becomes, the less possible it is for life to have evolved. Life is nothing but complexity. You see, complexity is the opposite of Darwinian expectations. If life were really, 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 really simple, maybe it would be possible for it to evolve. But the more complex life is, the less possible it is for it to evolve. And life is super complex, therefore evolution is simply not true. The easy argument to make. But if we dig into the cell, let's look at a simple organism. Let's just take a fruit fly. Now let's look at what's inside it. Now scientists have made a map of all the proteins inside a fruit fly. In fact, actually, this is only about 1/3 of the proteins they found. Each little dot's a protein. The green area in this map is inside the nucleus. The blue is inside the cytoplasm, and the yellow area is all of the proteins that are in the cell membrane and extracellular proteins. And each dot has a line connecting it to other dots. You can see a cutout and another cutout. And if we zoom up on here, this one little protein has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 other proteins, maybe 8 proteins it connects to. When I say connect, what do I mean? I mean, maybe the protein is shaped like this. There's another protein that comes in and sticks on here and prevents this protein from working. It's like a lock and a key. There's another protein that comes in here and twists this little part, which makes this protein work faster. Or there's another protein that does this or this. There's another one that fits in here and maybe cuts this one in half and breaks it. There's all these systems of perfectly shaped locks and perfectly shaped keys that link together in this incredibly complex system. But most of the time, if you break one of these links, like maybe this is truncated so this protein can't grab on and it can't actually turn it off, most of the time, if you change the shape of these proteins, you will kill the organism. Some things can be changed, like maybe a mutation creates a white-eyed fruit fly instead of a red-eyed fruit fly. Okay. Or maybe one creates a fruit fly with no wings. Okay. So some things you can survive, but most of the changes are deadly. So if a fruit fly evolved to this complexity, it can't evolve any further. But if it can't evolve any further, how could it ever have arrived here in the first place? This is all the hallmarks of design. This looks like it was made. It was a system that God created and delicately balanced and put these super duper complex links in there. That, yeah, a few of the links can be tinkered with. And that's what Darwin was talking about. But he did not know what was inside and how complex life actually is. He also knew nothing about how fast species can form. It's really funny, if you read The Origin of Species, you might look in vain for a definition of the word species. He's got it there buried deeply. It's really hard to find, but it's really vague because the father of biology or evolutionary biology never really defined what a species was. And today we struggle. There's two very famous evolutionists, Peter and Rosemary Grant. They have spent decades, every summer they go to this little island, the Galapagos, and all these decades they have tagged every bird. Now they're doing genetic analyses on these birds, and they've watched all the bird species on this island morph and change over time. Wait, morph and change over a short amount of time? Yeah. What they showed was that during the El Nino years, a lot of the bird species will interbreed. Wait a minute, they're different species. They can't interbreed, but they do. And during the La Nina years, a lot of the intermediate birds will die out. In fact, they showed the formation of a brand new species in 1 year. So we have all these birds on the island, different species, and we have a new bird of a totally different species. It looks totally different from the other birds. He flies in and he mates with one of the local birds, and the birds that grew up, they don't look like any other species on the island. In fact, they don't look like any other species anywhere else. It's a hybrid. They're half this and half that, and they sing differently, and they look different. That's our definition of species, but it's through hybridization because there are no species boundaries. All these birds are freely interfertile. What's a species is something Darwin never answered. In fact, recently, this paper appeared in Science, Shaking Up the Tree of Life. And the author asked this question: why are we only now discovering massive amounts of hybridization between species? Well, the answer is because Charles Darwin told us that species change very slowly over millions of years. And he was wrong. In fact, we can now see massive amounts of hybridizations between what we thought were species across the tree of life. I took these photographs in the Galapagos. This is a marine iguana and a land iguana. We are told that these have been separated for 3 million years. Now, that's about the same order of time that we are told that humans and chimpanzees have been separated. We're definitely different species, but these guys can hybridize. In fact, I took these pictures. There's a hybrid of these two things. 3 million years, nonsense. They have not been separated that long because they haven't been there that long. Or check out these two things. Here's two different tortoises. I took these at the giant tortoise breeding facility on the Galapagos. Notice this guy, he's got a saddle. And this one over here is a straight slope. They're two very different looking shells. Let me read you something that Charles Darwin said. He said, "My attention was first called to this by the vice governor, Mr. Lawson, declaring the tortoises differed from different islands, and that he could with certainty tell from which island any one was brought. I did not for some time pay sufficient attention to the statement." And later on, "I never dreamed." Darwin missed it. Darwin was a geologist, remember? Have you ever heard that Charles Darwin invented the theory of evolution while on the Galapagos Islands? That's an urban myth. In his own, this is the Journal of Researchers, 1845. We know he didn't see it. He invented it later. And yet, while we're on this breeding facility, I was talking to the managers, and they're trying to save some of the endangered species by breeding them with other species. Because these things, the only reason they look different is because there's slight genetic differences between the different populations because they're isolated from one another on different volcanic islands. But you bring them together, they're still just giant tortoises. They have not been there for millions of years. There's no evidence for that. But Darwin did start getting into biology, and he did start getting into evolution eventually. In fact, in one of his notebooks, he writes the words, "I think." Can you see that? And then he writes what, as far as anyone understands, is the earliest description of the tree of life, where he's got all these branches of things that are some are extinct and some are not extinct. So he starts getting into evolution, and he gives us this picture. Maybe you have seen something like this called the tree of life, that all species go back to a single common ancestor, right? Basic evolutionary idea. But this is not reflected in the genetics, because Darwin didn't know genetics. In fact, when we look at genetics today, we see this completely tangled web. At the base of the tree of life, there's no tree. Here we have bacteria and archaea, which is a bacteria-like thing, but they're much more complicated than bacteria. And then the eukaryotes. What's a eukaryote? It's everything between a carrot and a person. All the things that have nuclei in their cells. And when we look at which genes are shared within these three major groups, you see the completely random distribution because there's no tree. In fact, this lends credence to the creationist idea. We call it a creationist forest, that God created independent groups of organisms, separate from each other, with whatever God wanted to put into each branch, he did. And then over time, because God put into this creation the ability to adapt, the ability to speciate, we see different species appearing within limits. This is what we see in the fossil record. This is what we see. In fact, it's really funny because all the information that Darwin had is easily added to the creationist idea of the origin of species, which is that God created things in different categories like this. A lot more information on creation.com. In fact, we have a whole section, a speciation question and answer if you need more information. Okay, all that said, I've been trying to drive down to this idea. All that background information was so that I can tell you that Charles Darwin did not know what natural selection can and cannot do. So the centerpiece of all of Darwinian evolution is called natural selection. Do we even understand that? I'm going to read you something from his book, The Variation of Animals and Plants Under Domestication. He wrote this 9 years after the origin of species. And I just want to see if this is our concept of his central mechanism. Now, I do have to ask your forgiveness. This is 1800s writing. This is a very well-educated person with all flowery sentence constructions. It would drive any English teacher today crazy because we're taught modern ways. You write a sentence, period, another sentence, period, another sentence, period, and your ideas are short, brief, and nicely contextualized. That's not true back then. He wrote these long, convoluted sentences, and this is one reason why science is hard. Because when we read the old scientists, their writing isn't very good. But he writes, if living things vary, even in a slight degree, so he's starting off with little teeny variations between closely related organisms. Then if, in the long course of ages, so he's appealing to deep time. Notice that. It requires deep time. If inheritable variations ever arise, if, you have to understand, this is pre-genetics. He did not know the source of variation. He had no idea what inheritance was. He didn't know why some organisms look one way and some organisms looked another way. He's making this grand idea if it's true. So if inheritable variations arise that are in any way advantageous to any being under its excessively complex and changing relation, what he's saying is that the living world is chaotic. There's lots of variation amongst organisms, fine, but you can't necessarily know if that organism is going to live or not because you know what, an elephant might come and step on it, or a lightning strike might hit it, or a meteor, or maybe it's advantageous, but it just doesn't live long enough because it gets swept away in a flood. There's so much complexity. What he's saying is there's a lot of noise in the system. Then a severe and often recurrent struggle for existence will determine that those variants, however slight, which are favorable, shall be preserved or selected, and those which are unfavorable shall be destroyed. Let me give you a modern illustration. I think you're going to understand this. Let's just talk sports. It's the last game of the World Series. It's the bottom of the ninth inning. There's 2 outs, and your favorite player is at bat. Your team is 1 run behind, and it's a 3-2 count. And we didn't rent the car with the digital satellite radio. No, we got a car with the old-fashioned radio where you actually have to be close to a transmitter in a city, and you're driving out into the country, and your radio signal is getting weaker and weaker and weaker. And what you hear is, Casey Jones is at the bat. And there's a mighty swing. And you hear crack. And you hear the announcer say, it's going. And you never hear the end of the game. Because the noise is higher than the signal. Now, maybe you're recording it. Maybe you say, I got a recording, and you listen to the recording, and you listen to it, and you listen to it. Do you think you could listen to that recording 1,000 times and ever understand what happens at the end? No, because the signal is garbled. And what Darwin did not understand was something called the signal-to-noise ratio. He said there's lots of noise in the system, excessively complex and changing relations. He said the signal is very weak if they vary even in a slight degree. One of my jobs in college, I collected bugs in rivers all over Georgia. And then in the winter times, we'd sort them and identify them by the species. And the guy sitting next to me was like, this mayfly has 3 hairs on his front leg, and this one only has 2. And I'm like, I don't care. But he was so excited about this little variation. Well, Darwin's even a slight degree. Okay, this mayfly's got 2 hairs, and this one's got 3 hairs. But what if the world is really chaotic and the survival of that mayfly has nothing to do with how many hairs on his front leg? Then the whole system is going to come crashing down. In fact, it doesn't actually work because there's so much noise that the survival or not of an organism based on a little teeny disadvantage or advantage means nothing. So one thing is clear as we look at the natural world is that Darwin did not understand what natural selection can and cannot do. If you think about it, natural selection is the centerpiece of his idea. And yet he was unaware of the power of selection. He thought that little teeny changes acting over a long period of time can change species, but we don't actually see that. What we see is that species go extinct despite natural selection. In fact, this comes straight out of some of my own scientific research. There's a paper that I published with my dear friend and colleague John Sanford. We were studying the influenza virus, the H1N1 virus. That virus had appeared in humans in World War I, 1917, and has swept across the world and killed more people than died in the war. This is a terrible, awful, no good, lousy virus. And yet what we discovered is that it went extinct. See, that original strain is no longer circulating in people today. There is an H1N1 that we got from pigs. The swine flu still appears in people, but the human version is gone. After about 10 or 12% of his genome mutated, it died because natural selection could not save it. This is a plot. Ignore the bottom one. That's amino acid changes. This is letter changes in the genome of the virus over time. And I was shocked at what a straight line this is. This is just mutations accumulating, getting higher and higher and higher and higher. But wait a minute. This virus is under very strong natural selection. If you think about it, the virus is at war with the human immune system. Any virus that's not an excellent, strong, fast reproducing virus is going to get killed by the human immune system. There's a war happening here, very, very strong selection. And yet despite that, the mutations that don't really affect it very much are still accumulating over time. It's sort of like, imagine you have a car and your car has a little rust spot on it, a little mutation. That's not going to destroy your car. But given 100 years, your car is going to turn into a pile of rust and it'll be useless. And that's what happened with the influenza genome. Over about 100 years, these little mutations built up and built up and built up until it was so decrepit, it went extinct. This is an idea called genetic entropy. You can go to creation.com and type in genetic entropy, or maybe my evidence for genetic entropy article. This is profound because it's the antithesis of Darwinism. Darwin said natural selection can make an organism evolve. Well, no, we say that natural selection only slows down the eventual extinction of organisms because most mutations aren't powerful enough to have an effect on reproduction. And we saw that here in the flu, and we see that in people today and many, many other species. Really interesting to think about that Charles Darwin knew nothing about genetics, nothing at all. He did not understand how traits are passed from one generation to the next. And yet in evolutionary theory is all about how traits are passed from one generation to the next. In fact, one of my heroes, Gregor Mendel, the monk, wrote just a couple of years after The Origin of Species was published, he wrote the what we now call the laws of genetics. But people forgot him. Now, it's not true that he was unknown because there were Mendelians or Mendelists leading up to when Mendel was supposedly rediscovered in the 1900s. And there's at least 100 references to Mendel's works, but no one knew what to do with them because he wasn't a Darwinist. But there's other people involved in this discussion also. Another guy named Lamarck. Have you ever heard the phrase, the inheritance of acquired characteristics? Darwin believed this. Darwin, he was a Lamarckian. In fact, he wrote about how sailors are farsighted. And farsightedness is very inheritable. Therefore, because sailors are always exercising their eyes to look at the horizon, their children will be farsighted. And he wrote that jewelers are nearsighted. And because they're exercising their eyes and nearsightedness is very heritable, therefore, as a jeweler looks at these things up close all year long and all of his life, his children are going to be nearsighted because of exercising his eyes. Well, this is an idea that was disproven a very long time ago. In the 1800s, a scientist raised mice for generations. And every generation, he cut off their tails. And at the end, the mouse tails, that for the baby mice that were born, they grew up, the mouse tails were just as long as the initial ones, even though for all these generations, he had cut off their tails. So they weren't passing on tail length to their children. Let me think about it. I mean, imagine I start taking steroids and I start pumping out and I'm all ripped and I'm all muscular. And then I have a child late in life. That child is not going to be looking like Arnold Schwarzenegger. He's going to be some skinny guy like me because my genes, not my environmental exposure, is what's passed on. But that actually is changing also. There's a new field. It's called epigenetics. And it's really complicated and really amazing. It turns out that the environment does affect our genome, but not what genes we carry, what genes are turned on and turned off. In fact, we've also seen in some examples that these factors can be inherited from one generation to the next. So there's a mouse breed that if they give it one particular food, it'll have one color of coat. But if you get rid of that food, the coat will morph into another color. And the next generation will be the same color, next generation, the same color. But then you add that food again and it'll turn brown again. It's really weird. Or think about it this way. When a woman is pregnant with a female, with a girl baby, There's only about 22 cell divisions, and that baby's ovaries are finished with the egg cells already in place. So there's 3 generations present at the same time. So if the mother is a smoker, or if she starves, or if she has a disease, well, the baby girl is being affected by that, and the eggs in that baby girl's ovaries are also being affected. So the child that might be born maybe 40 years later, if this little girl grows up and has a child in old age, maybe 40 years later, this child, the grandchild, might be affected by something that happened in the grandmother. If this is Lamarckism all again, this is the environment influencing the way things look and behave and act. So Darwin was wrong for the right reasons or right for the wrong reasons is really complicated and really fun to study. Anyway, Darwin's Lamarckism vindicated right there on creation.com. It's a brand new field. It's really exciting. And honestly, Darwin knew nothing about it. The problem with this inheritance of acquired characteristics is it messes up natural selection. Because if this, say, baby girl here is suffering from some anomaly because of something that happened to grandma 40 years earlier, how's natural selection going to either kill off or let this girl survive? The signal is gone. The whole idea that the environment acts directly on genetics falls apart if there are signals that last for generations. I don't know. Biology is complicated, and Darwin didn't get it. He didn't understand that DNA, which we'd discover later, was going to be the most complex information storage mechanism that we know of in the universe. He didn't understand how DNA was going to be packaged in the cell. I remember when the human genome was first sequenced, one of the first studies that came out afterwards, scientists were looking at genes that were used in series. So this protein makes this protein makes that, this protein makes that, and finally you get something that like a sugar or something to use in your body. But you need all these proteins in a row. And they said, well, if life is efficient, all these proteins we package together at the same place in the genome so they can be used together. And when they actually looked at the position of the proteins, they found them all over the genome, randomly distributed. And they say, oh, look at that, it's just a bunch of junk. Millions of years of evolutionary experiments are all thrown in there willy-nilly, helter-skelter. There's no rhyme or reason to the genome. But then a couple of years later, some scientists realized that if you treat a cell with formaldehyde, the DNA cross-links. And if you cut the DNA up, you get all these X's. And the X's, if you sequence the arms of the X's, you'll look at genes that are next to each other in 3-dimensional space. And what we've learned is that the genes that are used together are found next to each other in 3D. Oh. That means that whoever programmed that first string of DNA, I mean, you have 6 feet of DNA in every cell. Whoever programmed all the letters in that string knew that when it folded up into a 3D shape, that all the different genes that are used together would be next to each other. That, my friends, is really complicated and really, really cool. There is exquisite design in the genome, and it is screaming design, not evolution. It's a very interesting paper that came out a couple years ago. Why didn't Darwin discover Mendel's laws? Darwin had more money, more time than Mendel did. In fact, in his book, The Variation of Animals and Plants Under Domestication, he had a classic table where if you ever taken high school biology, remember Punnett squares and the 3-to-1 ratio, dihybrid crosses, remember that? Anyway, he had this classic table where he had 3 of one and 1 of the other, 3-to-1 ratio. He had genetics right there, and he didn't see it, the author concludes, because of his preconceptions. Darwin was allowing his preconceptions to drive his views of science, and actually, he held back the progress of science for a long time, including his views on race, which are troubling. I'm going to read you something that's very not politically correct. If this bothers you, good. It should bother you. But this is part of the historical record. This is the writings of Charles Darwin in this book, The Descent of Man, 1871. He said, at some future period, not very distant as measured by centuries, the civilized races of man will almost certainly exterminate and replace the savage races throughout the world. Civilized, he means white Europeans. Savage, he means black and brown people. Ooh. At the same time, the anthropological apes will no doubt be exterminated. The break between man and his nearest ally will then be between man in a more civilized state and some ape as low as a baboon, instead of now between the Negro or Australian and the gorilla. Oh, that's horrible. That is awful. He put himself on the top of the evolutionary ladder. And so there's other people out there who are actually less evolved than I am. And he was wrong. He was absolutely, completely, 100% wrong. Everything in modern human genetics tells us that this is complete garbage. And yet, thoughts like this propelled a lot of racism throughout the 20th century and are still lingering today. And if you are a Christian, you need to reject such thoughts because they're just totally, incredibly incorrect. Creation.com, races, tons of articles on that subject for you. But not everyone in the day accepted Darwin's writings. Here's Sedgwick, writing right after Darwin published Origin of the Species. I've read your book with more pain than pleasure. Parts I read with absolute sorrow because I think them utterly false and grievously mischievous. You've deserted the true method of induction. Ouch. Could you imagine getting a letter from one of your mentors that read like that? Then he writes this. Now, in this part of his letter, he's talking about whether or not there's a ghost in the machine. As a classic philosophical theological argument. Do we have a spirit or are we just a machine? And he says this. He says, were it possible, which thank God it is not, to break that link between the spiritual and the physical, humanity, my mind, would suffer a damage that might brutalize it and sink the human race into a lower grade of degradation than any into which it has fallen since its written records tell us of its history. That man predicted the history of the 20th century, where more people died at the hands of atheistic, evolution-based governments at any other time in world history. We're talking not just the Nazis, we're talking about Stalin, we're talking about Mao, we're talking about Pol Pot in Cambodia. This is an awful period of time for humanity. And one of the reasons why someone like Joseph Stalin could go to sleep at night after writing an order that he knew would lead to the death of 10,000 people, was because to him, humanity had no spirit. They were just machines. So killing people wasn't any different to him than cutting the grass. Ooh, there's a lot of theology here in evolutionary theory a lot of people miss, but I'm going to wrap up with this. Charles Darwin apparently did not know basic Christianity. He grew up in a household. His mother and his wife were Unitarians. This is before the Unitarian Universalist amalgamation, but they weren't what we call an Orthodox Christian. His father and grandfather called themselves freethinkers. Later on, they would have called themselves agnostic. Today, they probably just would have called themselves atheists. I'm not sure. I can't put myself in their shoes. But he's growing up in a society, in a group without a lot of Christian influence. Now, he called himself an agnostic later on. There's actually no evidence in any of his writings for a real Christian understanding of anything. He uses flowery Christian language sometimes, but that doesn't mean anything. And importantly, there's no deathbed recantation. No, Charles Darwin did not recant on his deathbed. That is an urban myth. Creation.com for more details. Let me read you something from his autobiography. Now, my friends, forgive me, I'm going to use a rough word here, but this is from Charles Darwin's own pen, applying to Christianity. He says, "Thus disbelief crept over me at a very slow rate, but was at last complete. The rate was so slow I felt no distress, and have never since doubted even for a second that my conclusion was correct. I can indeed hardly see how anyone ought to wish Christianity to be true. For if so, the plain language of the text seems to show that the men who do not believe, and this would include my father, brother, and almost all of my friends, will be everlastingly punished. And this is damnable doctrine." First of all, Darwin, how dare you use that word? Are you kidding me? At the same time in world history, thousands of Europeans were going to other places in the world in this massive missionary movement, specifically a lot of people from England, and they were dying like flies. They were giving their lives to help people in other countries. They were building hospitals, they were building schools. They were serving people of brown and yellow and black skin tones. Now, no one's really yellow or black or brown. I got that. But they were serving people from a completely different race, even though races don't really exist. Oh boy, this would be a whole nother topic, what a race is in genetics and in modern biology. But here we have Darwin excoriating Christians, calling them horrible words. And yet he had no basis even to make that judgment. Now, under Darwinism, those were lesser people. They might not even been the same species. They might not even have the capability of understanding the gospel, let alone higher philosophical concepts. Why bother going to try to save them? One more quote from Darwin's autobiography. "A man who has no assured and ever-present belief in the existence of a personal God or a future existence with retribution and reward," that's heaven and hell, can have for his rule of life, as far as I can see, only to follow those impulses and instincts which are the strongest or which seem to him the best ones. That's called hedonism. If you're wondering why we're struggling in the Western world with sin and licentiousness and things that aren't Christian and are open in our society, it's because we're based on a Darwinian philosophy. In a Darwinian philosophy, the only rule of life is hedonism. Because there's nothing else to live for, you might as well do what you want. Oh man. Now let me ask you a question. If Darwin were alive today, if everyone in the world today was creationists, not evolutionists, and Darwin was alive, and all the stuff that we know about the incredible design, exquisite detail in the cell, and the complexity, would he still invent evolutionary theory? I believe so. I believe because Romans 8:7, the mind that is set on the flesh is hostile to God, does not submit to God's law. Indeed, it cannot. That's a hard verse. But when we understand what Scripture's saying is the people who reject God are going to reject God. So you can't expect someone to say, oh yeah, I believe in creation. Creation and Christianity really go hand in hand with one another. You can't expect someone to say, oh, I don't believe all this Darwinian stuff. I believe X. Well, actually, that's not true. Some people today do believe non-Darwinian ideas like aliens did it. Yeah, that's called intelligent design. That's not acceptable to the Darwinists. In fact, it doesn't actually answer anything because then you can ask the question, well, who created the aliens? Because even in the Big Bang model, they've only got a few billion years. There's not enough time for alien to alien to alien to alien to people. You can't have an infinite regression. It doesn't actually answer anything. And yet what we see is that especially younger professors today are struggling. They're growing up knowing that everything is really complex, knowing everything argues against Darwinism, and yet they still believe in it because the alternative is unacceptable to people. So what did Darwin get wrong? He got wrong the geology, he got wrong the biology, and he got wrong the theology. That's why he went in the direction that he went. Now, I've suggested a lot of creation.com articles for you. I would like now to point you to a couple of resources that might benefit you tremendously. And the first thing I'm going to recommend beyond anything else is Creation Magazine, because I think this is the tool God used to keep me in Christianity when I was a young person. That's not a joke. I was like 18, 19 years old. I didn't understand anything about creation. I never even considered it. And this comes into my life and whoa, it opened up all these windows in my mind. Really powerful stuff. And in fact, we also have a digital version or the print version or both. Just go to creation.com. You can figure it out. I've got several DVDs that I've produced over time. One is called Mitochondrial Eve and the Three Daughters of Noah. It's just me as a geneticist. I'm trying to explain that modern genetics has discovered evidence of Adam and Eve, Noah's flood, and the Tower of Babel. It's right there in the human genome. Perhaps my favorite thing I've ever done in public ever is called the high-tech cell. Here I am, I'm trying to explain how the human genome works, but no one understands how it works because it's too complicated. So I compared it to a computer, and very quickly it became a computer that was hyper-complex, unlike a computer that mankind can even build, because a genome is so incredible and it argues so strongly against Darwinian evolution. I would also highly recommend Evolution's Achilles Heels. This is a book and documentary project. We did them simultaneously. This is our best arguments against evolution. What we did was we picked things that sounded like good arguments for evolution, like natural selection, genetics, the rock record, the fossil record, radiometric dating, and we identified the fatal flaws in each one of those major areas of science. In fact, this is a powerful and profound presentation. I cannot tell you how many positive comments we've gotten from this. So if you're struggling with evolution, let me encourage you to read that or watch that. Here's a great book, Genetic Entropy and the Mystery of the Genome by my colleague, Dr. John Sanford. This man was an atheist for most of his life. He became a Christian, and then he became a creationist while he was at Cornell University. He is a famous geneticist. He invented the gene gun that's been used to make most of the GMO crops, at least in the early years. He's a super famous person, and yet he writes this book, which is an insider's look at evolutionary theory from someone who is in the middle of it. And I tell you what, he doesn't use complicated math. He doesn't use complicated wording. He just very simply lays it out with quote after quote, illustration after illustration, of why evolution actually doesn't work. Now, just like I started, I'm going to end with 1 Peter 3:15. In your hearts, honor Christ the Lord as holy, always being prepared to make a defense to anyone who asks you for reason for the hope that is in you, yet do it with gentleness and respect. Thank you. If you are watching live, we're going to spend about 30 minutes doing an impromptu question and answer. Feel free to ask any question you like as long as it's on topic. Now, if you want to get off topic, just visit creation.com first to read an article or two, and then maybe send us a comment or question and we'll answer it there. But anything that's appropriate to the discussion of Charles Darwin and what he doesn't understand, feel free, hit me. We're going to do about 30 minutes of it. If you're watching this after the fact, you're just going to see a canned Q&A, and you can read it and watch it if you want to, but then when it's done, go to creation.com, and we have tons more resources for you.